Okay. Hey, we're going to get started this morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Emily. I'm the senior curator at the museum. We are broadcasting this program live on Facebook as well as on Zoom. For those watching on Facebook, my colleague Devin will be monitoring the chat and transferring questions and comments over to Zoom. For those tuning in on Zoom, you are welcome to post comments and questions throughout in the chat, and I will, which is at the bottom of the screen. And once Rose and Valerie have finished their presentations, I will pepper them with questions. And then at the very end, if we have time, I will give a brief tour of a few of the quilts we missed during our June virtual tour. Before I get started though, I thought we'd give a brief overview of the exhibition and the history of the museum for those who are unfamiliar. This exhibition celebrates the museum's 10th anniversary as well as the 20th anniversary of the seminal publication, Wisconsin Quilts, Stories in the Stitches. In the 1980s, a group of women began documenting quilts throughout Wisconsin. They would hold documentation days at various venues, including historic sites and county fairs. And during these documentation days, individuals and families would bring their cherished quilts to be documented and tell the stories behind them. This went on for a number of years and continues to today. We still host biannual documentation days at the museum, and if you're interested in those, we post the dates on our website. The quilts are then assigned a number along with relevant documentation paperwork and are entered into an online database. So a bit before 2001, the women documenters got together and thought they really should write a book which compiles some of these incredible stories and thus produced Wisconsin Quilts, Stories in the Stitches. It was also re-released in 2009 in a second edition. 20 years later, in this year, we began trying to track down the quilts in the book to recreate the stories in an exhibition. Some quilts are in the museum's collections, but many of them remain with families. In total, we were able to locate about 35 quilts and have 30 on display, as some were deemed too fragile to travel. So today, I'm delighted to be joined by Valerie Davis of the Milwaukee Public Museum and Rose Gallenberger of the Wauwatosa Historical Society, who are both going to share the stories behind the quilts and their makers from their collection. The quilt at MPM, unfortunately, could not travel, but we are delighted that Valerie is here to share its story. And the quilt from Tosa is on view, so after the presentation, please come down and take a closer look. This is actually our last weekend for the exhibition, so the exhibition will be closing on Sunday at 4. A bit about the two of them. Valerie Davis is a textile historian and the honorary curator of textiles in the history department at the Milwaukee Public Museum. She holds a master's degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the history of textiles with an emphasis on quilts. And Rose Gallenberger is a historian and museum professional by training with an interest in material culture and early American history. Currently, she describes herself as a museum professional on hiatus due to COVID, and she now works at the Concordia University in Wisconsin. Prior to temporarily leaving the museum world, she worked at different historical sites between Massachusetts and Virginia, including Colonial Williamsburg, where she was able to study a few quilts in their collection. She is currently the Vice President of Education on the Board of Directors at the Wauwatosa Historical Society, where she first became acquainted with the Sarah Clapp quilt as an intern in 2012. When not working, she loves engaging in everything textile related, including spinning, knitting, dyeing, and sewing. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful speakers. Rose will go first.
Okay, give me just a moment to get set up. Okay, there we go. So thank you so much, Emily. I'm happy to be here today to talk about the Sarah Clapp quilt. It's one of our, well, I'm a little biased, but it's one of our most spectacular items in our collection, just because of its story and the elements in its construction. So those of you who are not familiar with Victorian crazy quilts, this is what it is. It's basically a quilt with different pieces of fabric pieced together in an artistic manner and might have some different embroidery and different stitch techniques. So they all vary a lot from quilt to quilt, but this one does have a lot of classic crazy quilt elements. I also think of this quilt as sort of like an album quilt because it's loaded with meaning, and each square was very likely made by different people and then sewn together. So I will be talking a little bit about the history of the quilt's owner, elements on the quilt, and preservation efforts. And Valerie Davis actually has been heavily involved with this quilt. So any questions that you have, she will be assisting me with answering, and she might even chime in a little bit about the history after my presentation as well. So a little bit about who the quilt was made for. Her name is Sarah Clapp Goodrich. She was born in 1855 in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, to Luther and Harriet Clapp. The Clapp family is actually a very prominent family in Wauwatosa history. Luther Clapp, her father, served as a pastor at the First Congregational Church in Wauwatosa from 1845 to 1873. That church is still very active today. As a young adult, she attended the Rockford Female Seminary in Illinois for 3 years and taught there for 2. In 1879, when she was 24, she heard about a call for female missionaries to China. She immediately applied, and that same year she was accepted, and she left home to become a missionary in China. While she was there, she met her husband, Reverend Chauncey Goodrich, also a fellow missionary, and they married the same year that they met in 1880. For most of their lives together, they lived in Tongchao, a district in Beijing. And during her time in China, she opened a school called the Goodrich School for Girls, which was named in her honor. She did make several visits home while she was a missionary in China. And on one of her visits in 1885, her family surprised her with this quilt. It was presented to her by her mother. It's likely that she is the one who organized its creation. But the squares, like I had mentioned earlier, were likely made by other family members and friends. It is full of meaning with well wishes by using flowers, other natural motifs, and different symbols. So we're going to take a look at some of these squares up close, and I will talk about the different meaning behind the flowers. Because as some of you might know, Victorians loved meaning with flowers and just kind of exchanging different well wishes with flowers. So looking at some symbols first, you can see on this square that there's an L. My theory is that the L was there possibly to represent Sarah's father, Luther. So to kind of have him part of the quilt as well, even though it was likely made entirely by female family and friends. On this square, we have a very ornate H and C. That would be for her mother, Harriet Clapp. It would be fairly safe to assume that she made this square. And on it, you can see some fuchsias. That's one of many flowers that you'll be able to see on this quilt and in these following slides. There's a horseshoe, obviously a symbol for luck. So wishing her good luck on her missionary journeys. There's also forget-me-nots on it. So, you know, just kind of a fond remembrance of friends and family back in Wauwatosa, and also that they wouldn't forget her. Of course, they had to include a cross on the quilt, very important part of her life, her faith, and being a missionary in China. It was her life's work. That's what she did for most of her life, and her family was heavily involved with that as well, the family that she had in China. There's peacock feather. The peacocks are frequently thought of as like Asian in origin. They did actually come from Asia. So one of her friends or family members might have included this as a symbol of her life in China. Now looking at some of the flowers, water lily, another square has a water lily, but this is probably the most well-preserved one. Water lilies mean purity of heart and goodness, which fits along well with her work as a missionary. This is likely a sweet pea. I should mention that for these different flowers, I researched them a lot, and some of these are best guess because some of them are in good condition, like that water lily or even these sweet peas. Others are not in so good condition. And of course, there's artistic license for those who embroidered these flowers. So I might be a little off. If you have some thoughts for what some of these flowers may be, feel free to mention them in the comments, questions, and I will definitely take those into account and do some research and see what the Victorian meaning is behind that, because Victorian meaning behind the flowers helped guide me in what the flower might be. So getting back to the sweet pea means departure. So I'm sure her family were happy that she was coming to visit, but also had her leaving in the back of their mind. And considering it was the 19th century, travel took a while, so they wouldn't necessarily have known when she would return. Pansy, the word pansy comes from a French word meaning thought, and it is a symbol of remembrance. Unfortunately, the square is very deteriorated, as you can see. The background fabric is largely missing, but the flowers are in a fairly good condition considering that deterioration. This square is actually one of the most well preserved. It's in perfect condition, has not been touched. It's the most beautiful square in my opinion because of that. And you can clearly see that the flower on here is a carnation. Now this particular type of carnation might be, the Latin name is, and forgive me if I pronounce it incorrectly, Dianthus chinesis. As you can tell, chinesis, China, is in its name, and that actually means China pink. So because of its link to China in its name, I think that that might be what this particular carnation is. And then with different flowers for Victorians, different colors have different meanings, particularly with roses, the carnations as well. So the color of the carnation could have been slightly different in its heyday. This is the color that is now. If they were originally red, red means alas for my poor heart. Pink means I will never forget you. White means sweet or affectionate. And striped, if one of these might be striped, I'm looking at the one in the lower left, means I cannot be with you. So with that meaning, that could be a good link to the family, just letting her know that they're always thinking of her and wish that they were with her or she was with them. Daisies mean innocence, child's flower. This could have been a well wish for a child. They were married, Sarah and Chauncey were married for about 5 years at this point. And I believe she, and Valerie can speak more to this, she had some miscarriages and she had at least one surviving child who wasn't born until after this quilt was presented to her. There are a few different flowers here, but I will go ahead and highlight the lily of the valley because it doesn't appear anywhere else on this quilt. It's usually associated with Pentecost just because of the appearance of the flower, and considering Sarah's missionary work and her deep faith, that would be a good symbol to have there, another religious symbol. Forget-me-not, again, this is probably one of the flowers that appears most often. After roses, there are different varieties of roses on this quilt that we will get to next. I sort of have a short section on that. So the dog rose means pleasure and pain. So joy of having her back with them and the pain of parting. We have the primrose. Primrose appears in other sections of the quilt as well. It generally means fond reminiscence and happiness. Rosebuds are for youth. They're usually associated with weddings, so that kind of makes me wonder if maybe this quilt could have been a belated wedding gift for her. because it was, again, 5 years after their marriage. I also want to bring up some different embroidery techniques on this quilt because it's quite beautiful. There's a variety of different embroidery techniques, a good way for those who participate in creating this quilt to show off their artistic sewing abilities. This one is stump work. It is the only embroidery on the quilt that is raised. So it's very noteworthy because of that. And the flower might be sumac, it might be hydrangea, it could be lilac. I'm not sure. There are some different flowers that are very similar to that out there. We have crewel work. So the thread is likely wool. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do fiber analysis on this quilt, a thorough analysis, but the appearance and texture indicates wool. And this is the only example of crewel work on the quilt. We have applique. There's another rose with applique. You can see the decorative buttonhole or blanket stitch stitching it on. And it looks like that someone might have actually drawn or painted the rose themselves as well. And then we have painting directly on the fabric. Unfortunately, the painted portions of the quilt have not survived very well. This was originally an owl, 2 owls sitting on a branch. This will actually come up a little later when I show some pictures of our preservation efforts. So as I had mentioned, the quilt largely consisted of decorative hand stitching, and then it was finished using machine. The border was machine stitched along with the backing. So heading back to the history of this quilt a little more, it's almost certain that she had this quilt with her her entire time in China. And her son, Luther Carrington Goodrich, who was born in China in 1894, was likely familiar with this quilt his entire life, since it was older than him. In 1901, violence broke out in China called the Boxer Rebellion. The rebellion had been stirring in China for a while as many Chinese became increasingly unhappy with the foreign interests in China, including the presence of missionaries such as Sarah and her family. So that was a major concern for her. Beijing was one of the centers of the rebellion, and that's where Sarah was with her family. Although there was undoubtedly uncertainty for the Goodrich family during the rebellion, Sarah, her family, and the quilt survived it. And if this is something you want to learn a little more about, Valerie would be happy to go into that history of the Goodrich family and the rebellion. So towards the end of her life, Sarah passed the quilt on to her son Luther, who was a professor of Chinese studies at Columbia University, quite fortuitous since he grew up in China. In 1985, exactly 100 years after the quilt was completed, and a year before his death, Luther donated the quilt to the Wauwatosa Historical Society, thus returning it to its creator's and owner's hometown. So that's very special, that circumnavigated the globe, spent so much time in China, and then came back home. As I had mentioned, although I have not been able to conduct a thorough fiber analysis of the quilt, it is safe to say that it was constructed using silk and cotton fabric. Some of the fabric types include velvet and satin. It seems like the thicker velvet has withstood the test of time a little better than the rest of the fabric. The nap might be worn off, but like the square with the carnations, it's in almost near perfect condition. The back is made of red cotton. It's fairly simple, but it is in very solid state. Even though the top is fragile, I was actually instrumental in arguing in favor of the quilt going to the museum for the display because the back is in such solid condition. So the crazy quilt basically has the same condition problems as other crazy quilts from this time period. The weft and much of the silk has disintegrated, leaving the warp threads lying loose on the quilt top. The weft threads are, for those of you who aren't familiar, are the threads that are woven in using a shuttle, and the warp threads are the ones that go on the loom in preparation for weaving. Some sections of the silk are completely gone. You might have noticed that in some of the blocks that I highlighted. In those sections, Valerie actually did some preservation in those, adding some crepeline to basically show what it would have originally looked like and dyeing it to the original color. Some of the stitching is broken, some hand embroidery is gone, but the outlines of what was originally there can be seen, and therefore we were able to figure out what some symbols and flowers are. An advantage of the disrepair, which it's kind of odd to say that it's an advantage, but it's true, and this is true for any textile. You can actually see the inside and how it was constructed, and you can actually see what the original color was. So that is kind of a silver lining on an unfortunate preservation issue. So I wanted to highlight two squares that we preserved at the Wauwatosa Historical Society. They're a team of volunteers who assisted in that. There's a picture from 9 years ago of Valerie and me working on our squares. So hundreds of hours were put into it by different volunteers, and Valerie trained us on how to handle the quilt and how to do couching stitches to secure the loose warp threads. So here's the square that Valerie worked on. It's of the owls. You can see the before and the after. So you can see the stitching that she put in there to secure the threads in place, particularly looking at the owls themselves and trying to put them back into place so you can actually see the owls. That is a square that Valerie wanted to take, and we were happy for her to take it because it's such delicate and precise work and very fragile with the painting on there. And then this is a square that I worked on. You can see some of the couching stitching there. Makes the fabric look a little like a basket weave. It gets, and I was able to get some of the work threads back in place. So this is all to prevent snagging happening on some of the loose threads, help stabilize it and have it in a state that's enjoyable for years to come. Wauwatosa Historical Society is very fortunate to have this quilt and its amazing story. We have so much information on it. Valerie had been very instrumental in getting this project up and going, doing a lot of research and being able to aid in the preservation efforts. And it's going to be an ongoing project for us in the Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Rose. Valerie, you can.
May I at this time just let you know, is this entire project in 2012 was underwritten by a group called the Questers, and a local chapter of the Questers. The Questers is international in the United States and Canada, and a local chapter in Wisconsin, the Prairie View Pioneers, wrote a grant to conserve this quilt, which you can see it was very extensive and nothing that the museum could do on their own. So a grant was written, and we decided to make the extent of the grant to do 6 squares because this has such a historical importance in the city of Wauwatosa. And just briefly, the Clapp family is very much of a family in Wauwatosa that's known about. Sarah, when she went to China in 1879, married Chauncey Goodrich, who was, like Rose said, was a missionary. And then in what they would do as missionaries, they would stay in China, but would return home on what they called furloughs. We can track Sarah's activities and her travels because of she wrote a journal. Her children wrote diaries, and plus the Missionary Society did newsletters tracking where all the missionaries were. So we know that she actually came home on a furlough. She had lost a child in China. She came home in 1887 spent the holidays, Christmas with the family. And I believe, and this is my feeling, is that that was when the quilt was gifted to her and to Chauncey. What also happened was that they had a child in the United States, their first child. And so they came and left back to China with the crazy quilt and with the baby. Unfortunately, the baby did not survive after a year. The quilt did, though, and in 1900, the quilt was always with them. This very violent activity was happening with the Boxers, and so they knew they had to flee. They were actually fled their home, their hospital, their schools. Everything was destroyed in the Boxer Rebellion. All they had was what they had on their back and in one small cart. And in fact, Sarah's daughter even said that the night before they fled, they only slept on a bare springs on their mattress. So we can assume that the quilt, since it still survives, traveled with her. So from when they fled Beijing, they went to Japan and recuperated they had some R&R. And then they went back to the United States by way of San Francisco. They went to Chicago. Sarah was in the hospital for a while. One of her daughters was mute. She had a lot of PTSD, which we would call it now, after going through this terrible experience. Even that little guy who was turned out to be the Chinese studies professor actually was shot in his ear. But he didn't remember that. But anyways, after they spent some time, they went to Ohio, and then they left New York, and then they went to Europe and visited other missionaries. They did travel to other parts of the world, like Hawaii, where there is a big missionary involvement there at the time. And actually, we can trace them through the newsletters that they circumnavigated the globe. They spent 3 years on the road with the quilt, and they eventually returned to their original city just outside of Beijing and rebuilt everything. The quilt stayed there in China until 1923, where Sarah passed away. 2 years later, Chauncey passed away in 1925, and that's when their son, Carrington, isn't his name Rose Carrington?
Yes.
Carrington, brought it back to New York, where he and his wife and his family lived. And then it was in the mid-1980s, when he was an elderly man, thought, this quilt should get back to Wauwatosa. So thank goodness this professor and his family brought it back to Wauwatosa, and here it resides. One other thing is that that it looks like that where you said it might be wool, I do believe it's silk chenille, but that's just my guess now. I don't remember.
Yeah, I'll have to do some fiber identification with a microscope.
The big thing was, as Rose said, was what happened was the silk was probably not the best quality of silk that Harriet, the maker, purchased. And what had happened, all the silk shattered and fell out, and all that was left was the warp, which was a cotton. And it started, as through handling, it started to get snagged. And so what we decided for these 6 squares was to couch them down there so they wouldn't snag anymore. So that was quite a project, and it was quite fun. And we successfully completed the grant for the Questers. And so it all turned out to be very happy for everybody.
Are her archives still at Wauwatosa, or where?
The archives, and they're at my house. And yes, I did write a couple of papers, did some programs on this, and now they're sitting here, and I'm going to get together with Rose, and we're going to get those archives over at the museum so other people can access them.
We do have a box of paperwork at the Historical Society as well. Sarah's missionary papers are actually at the Yale Divinity School. So they're way over there.
Yeah. and which they can be accessed too. Yale has set that up so they can, you can access. That's how I was able to access it because I didn't travel to Yale. So.
We had a couple of other questions from our audience. How valuable would this quilt have been during the time period?
Honestly, that's a good question. Honestly, I'm not sure. I think most of the value is in sentiment. Victorian crazy quilts were very common. Valerie, you work a little more with
I agree with you. We don't know. It's historical value. Somebody else would have looked at this quilt, not knowing any of the history, and have gone, yeah, it's not much.
Yeah, and just for comparison, when Valerie was training everyone on preserving such a quilt, we actually got a crazy quilt that was in really bad shape from eBay for, I don't know how much, couldn't have been more than $50.
To practice on before they worked on it. Yeah.
And how long did the project take to do those 6 squares?
We do have a record of hours somewhere. Unfortunately, I don't have it on me, but it is it's a few hundred hours.
Yeah. And there was, I think, 9 or 10 people working on the quilt. And it had lovely times getting together. Sometimes it would just be one person, sometimes it would be many. And so it was a nice project to work on.
Some work has been done on more than just the 6 squares, and that's all volunteer time.
Yeah.
One other question for both of you. How did you get interested in quilt preservation?
Well, my answer is probably shorter than Valerie's. My first internship was at the Wauwatosa Historical Society, and they're like, hey, we're working on preserving this quilt. And I said, oh, I sew. It's like, okay, great, you go work on it and get trained. So that's how I got into it. And I've always been interested in textiles.
I just got into it because that was because my interest is quilts and textiles and conservation, both keeping it in storage at a museum or exhibiting it is all part of the conservation of a textile. And so that was where my interest was. I never really got into it up to my elbows like I did with this crazy quilt though.
There was a couple of questions about gloves. I imagine it was really hard to sew with gloves on.
Yeah, that's a decision.
I don't think we had gloves on.
We didn't have gloves on.
What we did is we set up a protocol of where you come in, you wash your hands. There was a bathroom nearby, and came in and then used the work. And then every half an hour or so, or if you felt like you were touching your face or something, then you went and washed your hands again. We could not have done this very, very fine work with gloves on, not even the nitrile kind of gloves.
Yeah, and just comment to gloves in general as well. So I have curatorial background. I had an internship at Colonial Williamsburg. Some of it is up to preference as well. With gloves, you can't really feel the fabric, and this is true for paper as well. So you're much more likely to damage it than if you don't use gloves. Nitrile gloves are preferred over cotton gloves as well because oils from your hands can still get through cotton gloves. So some of it is preference, like for the preservation, there probably will have been some minor disasters if we were trying to sew while wearing gloves. We probably will have sewed fingers to the quilts.
Okay, well, thank you both. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Valerie now.
So okay, and I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, the quilt that I'm going to talk about is in the collection of the Milwaukee Public Museum, and it is dated 1856. We know it was made in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, and it was made by the quilt maker. We believe there was only one quilt maker. Her name was Caroline Seabury. Caroline was a immigrant from Cornwall, England, and immigrated to Wisconsin. She was married and widowed twice, had children, And we believe she may have used this quilt or made this quilt for her daughter for her wedding, although we can't absolutely confirm that. So this might be a wedding quilt. Now, this image that you're seeing in front of you was the image that was used in the Stories in the Stitches book. It was also,
Sorry,
yes.
we're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Let me know when you see it.
Okay, I shall.
Oh, that's a bummer. Can you hear my voice though?
We can hear you just fine.
Oh, okay, let me go ahead because I'm just keeping the screen. Maybe I should try doing that again. And just wait a minute. Let me repeat that. See, I got the slideshow. Are you seeing it yet, Emily?
Not yet.
Well, let me just do that over again.
Okay.
I'm going to close it and then try it again. Screen share. Come on, honey. Oh, you know, this worked through rehearsal. This is, let me just do that again. Try that again.
And you're doing the green button at the bottom, right?
Yep. Yep. Oh. Well, let me try that again.
We're getting there. Yep. And then if you could.
Oh, wait a minute. Now I'm walking out of here. Oh, now I'm gone. Wait a minute. Now, let's see, did I do my, okay. You are screen sharing, okay. And I'm gonna go to my minute. How about now?
We are seeing your screen, but we have the wrong window up. So perhaps, did you select the PowerPoint?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
What are you seeing?
We're seeing the Zoom meeting and your and a gray box.
Okay, okay, let's new share. It says that I'm screen.
There you go. There we go.
Are we do we have it?
We are seeing the quilt, yes.
Oh. Okay. As I was saying, this is the quilt that was used in the image was used in Stories in the Stitches, and it was used in the exhibition catalog in 1985. Now, this quilt was one of a big group of quilts that were donated to the museum in the mid-1980s by two very wealthy collectors. And I can just imagine when they walked into the museum, one was the lady was a volunteer there, and what she probably did was, you can have these quilts, but you have to do an exhibition. So they did, and it was called Dressing the Bed, and there was a catalog published. So this is the image. However, now you look at this. Okay, let me just first describe the layout, and then we're going to go into detail. There is 61 7-inch squares that are set on point with green sashing. There's 5 borders, and in each corner is a 9-patch red and white block. We'll talk a little bit about this green sashing because this photograph doesn't really bring out the vibrancy of the green. Let me go to the. Okay, I'm trying to advance the slide here. Oh, pooh. Now, why doesn't my slide advance?
You could try your arrow key.
Okay. No. I think I'm just got one picture here. Gosh darn it. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to go to share this another screen. And I may have been in the wrong. Let me try this. Okay.
You can hit resume slideshow, I think.
Let me get through I'm pushing slideshow, but it's not going. Let me advance some slides. This is another image, photograph taken, and you can see the difference between the two. It's okay. I'm just going to go on this format, so we aren't going to take too much time dinking around here. You see the stars. Now, this design that Caroline selected is called Bethlehem Star, which is a diamond shape put together. 9 diamonds are put together and then put in a 8-point star configuration. She set those on point with this really vibrant green sashing. And in a couple of places they call a miniature Bethlehem star, but I don't know who named it that. It is a Bethlehem star, though. Here is some detail of the blocks. You can see some of the quilting too. She did really a lot of quilting on here. Around each star is a vine and leaf quilting. She did a 9 to 10 stitches per inch. Here's the blue. Now this one is on when it was still on a roll, so that's why it's kind of but I wanted you to see the blue. This is a star, which it has some deterioration on, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. But here we've got a plaid and a print. Here we have a red print with a beige or a brown. I don't know why it's not going into the slideshow, but we'll continue. This is a check and a stripe that has, like I said, 5 borders around it of the green. There's actually 2 different green prints. And seeing this quilt in the very first time, you're actually shocked. I was shocked at how vibrant that green was. And so I'm wondering if I've never did a chemical analysis of it, but is this a indigo over a yellow to make the green, or is it something that came about in 1845 and that was called Chinese green, which was developed? It was an expensive dye, but it was done in one pot. I don't know. I'm just kind of putting that off there. What I do know, it isn't Shields green or poison green. Now you've noticed that those borders around the quilt, the red border, this is probably the only bad choice in fabrics that Caroline did. Unfortunately, she wouldn't have known it at the time. And we see this in old quilts where the dark part of the pattern, the figure, was so corrosive, maybe an iron gall in the dye, I'm not sure, but it has completely rotted away and fell out. So all that you have left is the red and the yellow, which is stable. And then the white part of that is actually the cotton batting. By the way, this is all cotton, and the batting is cotton, and the backing is cotton too. It does have a the edging is brought from behind and then made into a border around the edge. This is the nine block corner blocks. That yellow and red is in really good shape of paisley. This is the back, and her just quilted everything on here, from the leaves and the vines to triple rods to checkerboards to clamshell. She tried every one of her quilting designs, I think, that she had in her repertoire. And this is the, in 2015, I had the real pleasure of hosting the American Quilt Study Group to come to the public museum. And there we talked about this Mineral Point quilt. There I am in the green jacket with my mouth open. It's not a very good photograph. That's because it was taken by one of the other curators, and he just took kind of a impromptu talk, and now it's on the wall of our lab. And so I thought, well, I want to show folks that. What I want to finish with is how it's inscribed. And Caroline wrote her signature and the date twice. And the reason she did that was, I think, because no matter which way you would put the quilt onto the bed, it would show her signature, it would show her name. And let me, if I can go up real quickly to the first thing here, it would have been in the top center and in the bottom center. And so, like I said, no matter which way you would have put the quilt on the bed, you would have been able to read her name on it. So as like I said, she was an immigrant, and I picture myself here as an immigrant from Cornwall, settling in Western Wisconsin, in Mineral Point. Was she poor? Did she have resources? Well, by the time this quilt was made in 1856, she was not poor. She was well established. She was a phenomenal needlewoman. She used techniques on this quilt. Her quilting was excellent. Her choice of fabrics was really amazing. And I think she spent more than the usual amount of money on fabrics. And then, as to top it off, to really to tell people that this was her best effort. She was a master's needlewoman, and this was her masterpiece. She signed it twice. Then, as it's been described before, is that this is a backstitch. It says C. Seabury, and in Mineral Point, March 4th, AD 1856. This embroidery is very raised above the fabric. She quilted as much as she could around the stitching, but I think, and this is just a theory of mine, that this isn't a backstitch. This is actually tambour work, that she actually put this on before she quilted it, that she actually used a tambour hook and a frame and actually did this in tambour work. So it would actually be raised even more off the surface of the quilt. Okay, so I think quilting. Okay, one other thing that I came across just recently was in 1984 when this quilt was donated. The donors actually had it appraised, and the appraiser was very romantic and really went over the edge, over the top, in describing this very flowery language. One phrase that she used in description of the quilt: a breathtaking array of stars that twinkle and shimmer across the surface of this masterpiece. And then she, if anybody is interested, this is 1984, what she appraised the quilt for. And she appraised it for $5,800. So that must have made the donors happy. Okay.
Thank you, Valerie. We had one question. So the fabric she would have purchased especially for this quilt, or do you think would it have been used elsewhere, like in dresses or shirts?
I would say that there's a possibility that she did both. I'm going to show you that slide again. That all those different colors, from blue and all different colors, may have come from her scrap bag. She had access to a lot of different prints. Um, but the sashing, which is quite a bit of fabric, may have been purchased for the execution of this quilt. So she may have done both. Where she had access to this fabric, this is always captivates me, mid-19th century, and she's in a place like Mineral Point, Wisconsin. Where did she have access to fabric? They didn't have a Sears catalog, or she couldn't go to her Joann Fabrics or anything. So how she acquired this fabrics, I don't know. One clue is that we have to do more research on that. Her daughter, the quilt ended up living in Chicago. So, but I don't know if Chicago was any more had any more availability of fabrics than Milwaukee did. So she may have. It's just speculative unless we can actually find out what kind of. It's amazing. I've looked at account books and of different general stores of fabrics, and they really had access, even in the mid-19th century, of a lot of different fabrics. So this might have been just going to her general store in Mineral Point, or maybe to a larger community, and then purchasing that green fabric. I think that green fabric would probably have been, since it's so well, its color and its vibrancy is so well preserved, that it probably, and this is I'm speculating here, that it was more expensive. Like I said, the only one that really fell apart was that that red border, and that she couldn't have known about.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing it. Oh, one other question. Was the Star of Bethlehem a popular pattern at the time?
Well, the way Caroline did it, the way she designed it, this is why I think she's a master quilt maker, is the way I have not seen it configured this way. And a lot of time, I think the pattern is popular. It is still popular. Sometimes it's referred to a lone star because it's the diamond within a diamond shape, a larger diamond shape, and then they're configured into 8 points. So I think it was a popular pattern at the time, but she was the designer to configure it so that they filled 7-inch blocks, and then the 61 stars filled in with the sashing. So I think that was her original design. I don't think, I haven't come across, if anybody else comes across with the design, but I don't think she took anybody else's design. I think Caroline is the one that designed this quilt. And it was tricky. The piecing is, they're very small.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Peggy Haas shares that Mineral Point was a boomtown in the 1850s. Lots of access to Galena, the Quad Cities, Madison, Chicago. So
there you go. So that's a really good. Thank you for that little clue. So to look at the economics of that town right now, I think of Mineral Point as small, but in the mid-19th century, like I say, it could have been a boomtown, which means it would have had access to a lot of products coming in, because they had customers for them that were interested. I have to really completely throw out the idea that Caroline Seabury was poor, and that she was I don't know what kind of educational level she was, but as far as her needlework and her skills, she was a high skill level. And she probably was at least a middling or maybe upper middle class lady, or had the resources to purchase all these wonderful fabrics for this quilt.
And this quilt was completely hand stitched, right?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, Thank you so much. There's one other question that I didn't get a chance to ask Rose, or maybe Valerie, you can answer as well. There was a question about the fabric that's shredding on the Crazy Quilt. What type of fabric was that? Was that silk originally, or?
That was a silk combination. Silk warp, excuse me, silk weft and cotton warp. And so it's a lot, we have all seen it that looked at Crazy Quilts where the silk shatters and breaks apart into pieces and falls out, and then there's nothing. But in this case, the silk had shattered, fell out, and what was left was the warp, which was cotton. And that's what we had to couch down onto the background fabric just so it wouldn't snag, and then we could have some kind of a semblance. Like with those two painted owls on top. The painted owls actually was painted on the silk, and then when everything else fell apart, the paint actually kept the silk underneath the two owls together. So it was kind of floating on top of all these strands of cotton. And I just had to couch those down. It was actually couched all around the owls. But you couldn't couch where the paint was because those owls were all paint, but it actually preserved the silk underneath them.
Do we know what kind of paint that was?
That's a good question. No, it's not, whatever it was, let's say that's from the 1880s. Did Harriet paint those, or did she have somebody else? It's been kind of put forward that maybe Harriet wasn't the only one that worked on this quilt. What I do know is Sarah was not the maker of the quilt. She may have put a couple stitches in when she was on furlough at her parents' home. That's where they stayed. But she certainly wasn't the mover and shaker with the creation of this quilt. And then she actually was a beneficiary, though. She was the gifted of the quilt and then kept it with her for entire life and then her son's life.
And then one more question. Julia was wondering if you could describe the tambour method a little bit more.
Oh, the tambour. Okay. That just kind of hit my I did a little research on that, and like I said, I'm not familiar with tambour work, but it does produce, you can make very raised embroidery on top of a fabric. It can even be used to apply beading to it too. And what you do is it goes into a tambour frame, and you actually use a tambour hook, which actually, and you can go to YouTube to see how they do this. You actually pushes the hook and the thread into the fabric and then pulls it out, and it's kind of a loop on a loop on a loop, which kind of resembles a back stitch, only it gives a much more raised appearance than a back stitch. That's why that's my theory. How will I prove that? Well, there is no possibility, the way that the quilt is, to look at the back of the quilt. So that might just be kind of something for maybe those tambour embroidery people who are experts could make a judgment on that. Or maybe it's just very, the floss, I used it when it was done, the back stitch. It was used a thicker floss. But it kind of fits in with everything that Caroline did. She went up to up and above the quilt, just to make it a masterpiece and to show the umpteenth of her own personal skills. And I think that is the fact that it was signed twice, and then the signature is facing in two different directions. So no matter how you put the quilt, it's going to show upright. The fact that she went and got this fabulous green fabric for the sashing. There's nothing inexpensive or although the fabrics in the stars may have been part of her scrap bag, she may have purchased them too. She certainly had, like I said before, access to a lot of different fabrics. And you consider there's 61 squares. Some of the fabrics were used more than once, but there's two contrasting fabrics in each star. So she's, there's over 100 different cotton prints on here. So she had access to a lot of good fabric.
Thank you both. We really appreciate all your expertise and you sharing these two wonderful quilts with us. That brings us to the top of the hour, so I wasn't able to give the completion of the tour, but we do have quite a nice virtual tour on our YouTube page. And this, if you want to reference anything here, this program will be on our YouTube page by the end of the day. It also will be archived on Facebook. So I just wanted to thank you all for joining us and thank Valerie especially and Rose especially for sharing their knowledge this hour. So thank you.
You.
Okay, you're very welcome. It was a lot of fun.
Lots of thanks in the chat as well. I don't know if you can see that, you guys.
And thank all of you for joining us.